The Last Lion, Winston Spencer Churchill, Visions of Glory, 1874 to 1932, by William Manchester. Introduction. Imagine for a moment, it's May of 1940. The world is holding its breath. One by one, the great nations of Europe have fallen like dominoes. The seemingly unstoppable German war machine has crushed everything in its path. France has collapsed. The Dutch have been overwhelmed. The Belgian army has surrendered. And the entire British army is trapped on the beaches of a little fishing town called Dunkirk, with their backs to the sea, seemingly doomed. This was England's greatest crisis since the Norman conquest. The Royal Navy said they'd be lucky to save 17,000 men. The House of Commons was warned to prepare for hard and heavy tidings. It looked like the end of 1,000 years of history. And in this moment of absolute despair, as the world braced for the fall of Great Britain, the king sent for one man. A man who had been in the political wilderness for a decade. A man who was considered by many to be a relic of a bygone era, a warmonger, an unreliable maverick. A man who had failed more spectacularly than almost any other politician of his time. His name, of course, was Winston Churchill. Today we see Churchill as a giant, a legend carved in stone. But what we forget is that for most of his life, he was an underdog. He was a lonely, neglected child. A schoolboy who was at the bottom of his class. A young man plagued by a stutter and a lisp, and haunted by what he called his black dog of depression. So how did this man, with every disadvantage, forge himself into the leader who would save the Western world? That is the story we're going to explore today, through the pages of William Manchester's masterpiece, The Last Lion, Visions of Glory. This is the first volume of one of the most celebrated biographies ever written, and it covers the most important part of Churchill's life, his formation. It's the story of how the lion found its roar. By the end of our journey today, you'll understand the forces that created this incredible character. You'll learn about the profound childhood insecurities that drove his ambition, the secret to his unmatched courage, and the personal philosophy that allowed him to rise from failure again and again. This isn't just a story about history, it's a timeless lesson in resilience, character, and the art of becoming who you are meant to be. Book summary. To understand a man like Winston Churchill, you have to first understand the world that made him. He was born in 1874, at the absolute zenith of the British Empire. It was a world that seems almost mythical to us now. The British journalist John Wilson once wrote that the sun never sets upon the Union Jack, and it was true. At any given moment, somewhere on the globe, Britain's colors were being raised. Victoria reigned over a quarter of the world's land and a quarter of its people. Her domain was 3 times the size of the Roman Empire. London wasn't just a city, it was the head of the world, caput mundi. The world's clocks were set by Greenwich. The Near East and the Far East were called that because they were near and far from London. The gold sovereign was the strongest currency on earth. This was a world built on absolute confidence. By arms or by arrogance, Englishmen had persuaded the world that they belonged to a race meant to rule. And they ruled by consent, with an astonishingly small number of men. In India, for example, the rule of the Raj was managed by roughly 1 civil servant for every 200,000 subjects. It was a world of heroes and grand adventures. Men like Chinese Gordon, Cecil Rhodes, and a man named General Wolseley, whose name became so synonymous with excellence that Londoners would say something was all Sir Garnet if they meant it was top-notch. These men were held up as examples of what courage and determination could achieve for the glory of the empire. This was the grand, theatrical, and deeply romantic world that young Winston Churchill was born into. He entered it not on the main stage, but in a small cloakroom at Blenheim Palace, his family's ancestral home, born 2 months prematurely after his mother had taken a fall during a shooting party. It was a dramatic entrance, and it set the stage for a life filled with drama. But the boy's early years were anything but glorious. His parents were two of the most dazzling figures of their age. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a brilliant and fiery politician, a man many believed would one day become Prime Minister. His mother, Jenny Jerome, was a stunningly beautiful American heiress who captivated everyone she met. She was, as Winston would later write, a fairy princess who shone for me like the evening star. I loved her dearly, but at a distance. And that was the tragedy of his childhood. He loved them both, but they were distant, caught up in a whirlwind of parties, politics, and social engagements. They simply had no time for their son. His father barely tolerated him, believing him to be slow and unintelligent. And his mother, he later realized, largely ignored him until he became interesting. So, the young Winston found love and security not with his parents, but with his nanny, a woman named Mrs. Elizabeth Everest. He called her Womb. She was his confidant, his friend, the one person to whom he could pour out all his childhood troubles. She was, he said, his dearest and most intimate friend. This relationship was the emotional anchor of his early life. It was Mrs. Everest who gave him the unconditional love his parents withheld, and her simple, steadfast affection shaped his view of the world in profound ways. But her comfort couldn't shield him from the harsh realities of the British upper-class education system. At the age of 7, he was ripped from his nursery and sent to a brutal boarding school called St. George's. The headmaster was a sadist who flogged the boys mercilessly for the smallest infractions. Churchill, with his highly sensitive skin, suffered terribly under the birch rod. He was small for his age, with pale, fragile hands, a stutter, and a lisp. The other boys, sensing weakness, bullied him relentlessly. They beat him, ridiculed him, and pelted him with cricket balls until he would flee, trembling and humiliated, to hide in the nearby woods. This was hardly the making of a lion. He was, by nature, a sensitive, uncoordinated, and emotional boy. But it was here, in the depths of his misery, that something extraordinary happened. He made a conscious decision to change his own nature. As a Victorian, Churchill believed that a man could be the master of his fate, that biology need not be destiny. And so, he began a lifelong battle to forge a new self, to go against his own inner nature and become the bulldog, the warrior, the indomitable leader he believed he was meant to be. He threw himself into dangerous situations, almost as if to test his own courage. He nearly killed himself leaping from a bridge during a game of tag, falling 30 feet and lying unconscious for 3 days. He suffered countless injuries from steeplechasing and polo, permanently damaging a shoulder that he would have to strap to his side for the rest of his active life. He wrote in 1893, "I am cursed with so feeble a body, that I can hardly support the fatigues of the day." Yet he refused to yield. He built an image of tireless machismo, a man who ate, drank, and smoked to excess, projecting an aura of superhuman vitality. It was a mask, but it was a mask he would wear for the rest of his life, until the mask and the man became one. This inner struggle came at a cost. All his life, Churchill suffered from bouts of deep depression, what he called his black dog. It was a melancholy that ran in his family. His father had it, as did many of his ancestors, the Dukes of Marlborough. It was a darkness that would descend upon him in moments of failure or rejection, filling him with feelings of hopelessness. He once told his doctor, "I don't like standing near the edge of a platform when an express train is passing through. A second's action would end everything." To combat this darkness, he developed two powerful weapons: incessant activity and a need for a great antagonist. He filled every waking moment with work or hobbies, painting, bricklaying, writing, because, as he told a friend, unless he was perpetually active, he would relapse into dark moments of impatience and frustration. But nothing energized him more than having a worthy enemy. He was a born fighter. His mind needed a grand conflict, a clear struggle between good and evil. For much of his life, he struggled to find one. As the author Anthony Storr writes, in day-to-day existence, antagonists are not wicked enough. Then, a man named Adolf Hitler entered his life. Here, at last, was pure evil. A monster who deserved no pity. A tyrant he could fight without any pangs of conscience. The rise of Hitler unlocked something in Churchill. It transformed his greatest weakness, his deep well of aggression and his depressive nature, into his greatest strength. It released enormous stores of vitality that had been suppressed for years. The challenge from Germany gave him the one thing his soul craved, a righteous and epic battle for the fate of the world. But that was all in the future. As a young man, his battles were smaller, and they were mostly for his own advancement. His father, Lord Randolph, had concluded that Winston was not clever enough for a career in law, and seeing his son's vast collection of over 1,000 toy soldiers, he decided the army was the only suitable path. Winston's academic record was abysmal. He was at the bottom of his class at Harrow, and he only managed to get into the military academy at Sandhurst on his third try. His mind simply wasn't suited for conventional learning. He couldn't, or wouldn't, learn subjects that didn't engage his imagination or his reason. He was a disaster at Latin and Greek, and his struggles with mathematics were legendary. But at Harrow, he made two discoveries that would shape his destiny. First, he discovered he had a phenomenal memory. At age 13, he recited all 1,200 lines of Macaulay's Lays of Ancient Rome without a single mistake. Once he committed something to memory, it was there forever. Decades later, after a stroke, he could still recite long poems he hadn't read in 50 years. Second, and more importantly, he discovered the power and beauty of the English language. A young teacher named Robert Somervell took the dolt of the school under his wing and taught him the essential structure of the British sentence. Churchill fell in love with words. He would say they had a magic and a music all their own. He began to read voraciously, Gibbon, Macaulay, Shakespeare, Dickens, and to practice the art of writing and speaking. He would later say, "It was my only ambition to be master of the spoken word." It was an ambition he would achieve more fully than perhaps any man in modern history. After Sandhurst, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the 4th Hussars, a cavalry regiment. But peacetime army life in England was boring for a young man hungry for glory. Medals and a reputation for bravery, he knew, were the currency of political advancement. The problem was, as he later wrote, the empire had enjoyed so long a spell of almost unbroken peace. So, he decided to go looking for war. This was a time when a young officer from a powerful family could still bend the rules, and Churchill's mother, Jenny, finally taking an interest in her son's career, began to pull strings. She was one of the most influential women of her time, intimate with the most powerful men in the British establishment, including the Prince of Wales himself. So, in 1895, at the age of 20, Winston used his leave to travel to Cuba, where he got his first taste of battle covering the guerrilla war against the Spanish. He came under fire for the first time, and he loved it. He wrote to his mother that the sound of bullets whistling overhead was more exhilarating than anything he had ever known. After Cuba, he sailed with his regiment to India. Stationed in Bangalore, he found the life of a British officer in the Raj to be one of luxury and ease. Labor was cheap, the climate was pleasant, and there was endless polo. But Churchill was restless. He felt his mind stagnating. So he began what he called his own university. He wrote his mother and asked her to send him books, Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Macaulay's History of England, Plato, Aristotle, Darwin, Schopenhauer. For the next 3 years, during the long, sweltering Indian afternoons, while his brother officers slept or played cards, Churchill devoured these classics. He wrote, "I scribbled all my opinions on the margins of the pages." He was building, piece by piece, the intellectual foundation that would support his entire political career. But reading wasn't enough. He needed action. In 1897, he learned that a field force was being assembled under General Sir Bindon Blood to put down a Pathan uprising on the northwest frontier of India. Churchill had met the general once and extracted a promise that if he ever went to war, he could come along. He immediately sent a telegram reminding Blood of his pledge and rushed to the front, this time not just as an officer, but also as a war correspondent for the Daily Telegraph. The fighting in the Malakand Pass was brutal and vicious. "It is a war without quarter," he wrote his mother. "They kill and mutilate everyone they catch, and we do not hesitate to finish their wounded off." He saw things that were not very pretty, but he was in his element. He rode along the skirmish line on his gray pony when everyone else was taking cover, not out of foolishness, but because, as he admitted, "I play for high stakes, and given an audience there is no act too daring or too noble." He was building his reputation. The next year, he found his way to the Sudan, where General Herbert Kitchener was leading an Anglo-Egyptian army to reconquer the territory lost after the death of Chinese Gordon. Churchill, through his mother's relentless efforts, managed to get himself attached to the 21st Lancers, just in time for the climactic Battle of Omdurman. There, on September 2, 1898, he participated in the last great cavalry charge in British history. 310 Lancers charged what they thought was a small band of dervish riflemen. To their horror, they discovered too late that they were plunging into a dry riverbed packed with nearly 3,000 enemy spearmen. The collision was tremendous. Churchill, his bad shoulder making a sword impractical, drew his new Mauser pistol. "I was surrounded by what seemed to be dozens of men," he wrote. "I rode up to individuals firing my pistol in their faces and killing several, 3 for certain, 2 doubtful, 1 very doubtful." He shot one man who was about to strike him with a sword at such close range that the pistol itself struck the man. It was over in 2 minutes. The Lancers had lost a staggering 22% of their men. The charge had been glorious, but strategically useless. Churchill, however, had survived again, and his dispatches to the Morning Post were making him famous back in England. His ambition was now burning brighter than ever. He had tasted war and fame, and he wanted more. The next opportunity came in South Africa, where the Boer War broke out in 1899. This was a different kind of war. The Boers were not tribal warriors with spears, they were tough, resourceful Dutch farmers armed with modern German Mauser rifles, and they were fighting on their home ground. Churchill went, again as a correspondent for the Morning Post, earning an astonishing £250 a month plus all expenses. Not long after arriving, he joined a reconnaissance mission on an armored train. It was a death trap on wheels. The Boers ambushed it, derailing several cars and pinning the British soldiers down with heavy fire. For the next 70 minutes, Churchill displayed extraordinary courage. Though a civilian, he took command, directing the efforts to clear the track and get the engine, loaded with wounded men, to safety. He was under continuous fire the entire time. One survivor later wrote, "I cannot speak too highly of his gallant conduct." But his luck finally ran out. As he was returning to help the remaining soldiers, he was cornered by a Boer horseman. Unarmed, he had left his pistol on the locomotive. He had no choice but to surrender. He was now a prisoner of war, held in a makeshift camp in Pretoria. For a man of his temperament, captivity was torture. He wrote, "I certainly hated every minute of my captivity more than I have ever hated any other period in my whole life." He demanded his release as a non-combatant, but the Boers, having read the British newspaper accounts of his heroism at the train ambush, knew better. They considered him a valuable prize. So, Churchill decided to escape. On the night of December 12, 1899, he scaled a wall when the sentry's back was turned and dropped into a garden. He was alone, 300 miles from friendly territory, in a hostile country where he didn't speak the language. He had no map, no compass, only 75 pounds, 4 slabs of chocolate, and a few biscuits. He managed to hop a freight train heading east, burrowing into empty coal bags. For days he traveled, hiding in a coal mine shaft by day, sharing his shelter with a swarm of white rats, and riding the rails by night. The Boers had put a price on his head, 25 pounds, dead or alive. A notice described him as an Englishman. Walks with a slight stoop, pale appearance, red-brown hair, almost invisible small mustache, speaks through the nose, cannot pronounce the letters S. His escape was a masterpiece of luck and daring, aided by a small group of British sympathizers who hid him and eventually smuggled him into Portuguese East Africa concealed among bales of wool. When he finally crossed the border and saw the Union Jack flying over the British consulate, he was, as he wrote, like a drowning man pulled out of the water. When he arrived in Durban, he was a hero. The story of his escape had electrified the empire. After a year of disastrous defeats for the British Army, here at last was a story of triumph. Crowds mobbed him, carrying him on their shoulders and demanding a speech. He had what he had always wanted: fame. He returned to England in the summer of 1900, just in time for the khaki election. At the age of 25, he stood for Parliament in the working-class district of Oldham. This time, he won. He had finally arrived in the arena where he believed his destiny lay. He took his seat in the House of Commons in 1901, the year Queen Victoria died, marking the end of an era. Churchill, however, was just beginning. He quickly made a name for himself as a brilliant, if sometimes reckless, speaker. But he was impatient. He felt stifled in the Conservative Party, which was dominated by old men who distrusted his ambition. In 1904, in a move that stunned the political world, he crossed the floor of the House of Commons, abandoning the Conservatives and joining the opposition Liberal Party. It was an act of incredible political courage, or, as his enemies saw it, of blatant opportunism. The Tories would never forgive him. They called him a traitor to his class, the Blenheim Rat, but Churchill was looking to the future. The Liberals swept into power in 1906, and Churchill's career took off. At 33, he became the youngest cabinet member in nearly half a century. Over the next few years, he and another rising star, David Lloyd George, formed a powerful alliance. They were the terrible twins of the Liberal government, pushing through a revolutionary program of social reform. They established labor exchanges to help the unemployed, created a system of unemployment insurance, set minimum wages in certain industries, and laid the groundwork for old age pensions and national health insurance. It was the beginning of the British welfare state, and Churchill was one of its chief architects. He was a whirlwind of energy. He moved from one cabinet post to another, President of the Board of Trade, Home Secretary, and then, in 1911, the job he had coveted most, First Lord of the Admiralty. It was a time of growing tension in Europe. Germany, under Kaiser Wilhelm II, was building a massive fleet to challenge Britain's supremacy on the seas. Churchill, who had once been an advocate for a smaller navy, now became its greatest champion. He threw himself into the task of preparing the Royal Navy for what he now saw as an inevitable war. He championed new technologies, submarines, naval aviation, and a strange new armored vehicle that ran on caterpillar tracks, which he called a tank. He worked with the legendary, if eccentric, Admiral Jackie Fisher to build a new generation of faster, more powerful battleships. He was, as Prime Minister Asquith wrote, very bellicose and longing for a sea fight. He got his wish in August of 1914. When the Great War broke out, Churchill was at the height of his powers. In those first few months, the Royal Navy, which he had made ready, swept the seas of German commerce and bottled up the German fleet in its home ports. But on land, the war quickly bogged down into the bloody stalemate of trench warfare. Churchill, a man of action, could not stand the thought of a war of attrition. He believed there had to be a way to break the deadlock. His restless mind searched for an alternative, a way to use Britain's naval power to strike at the enemy's weak flank. He found it in a narrow strait separating Europe from Asia, the Dardanelles. His plan was bold and imaginative. A British fleet would force the Dardanelles, knock Turkey out of the war, open a supply route to Russia, and rally the Balkan nations to the Allied cause. It could, he believed, shorten the war by years. It became his obsession. The naval attack began in February 1915. At first, it went well. The outer forts were silenced. But the Turks, advised by German officers, had mined the strait heavily. On March 18, the Allied fleet made its main assault. In a single day, 3 battleships were sunk and 3 more were crippled. The admiral on the scene, de Robeck, lost his nerve and called off the attack. Churchill was aghast. He knew, from intercepted German messages, that the Turks were almost out of ammunition. He believed that one more push would have seen the fleet through. But the admirals on the spot, and Kitchener at the War Office, now insisted that the Navy could not succeed without the help of the Army. So began the tragic and heroic Gallipoli campaign. But it was too late. The Turks had been given a month to fortify the peninsula. When the British and Anzac troops landed, they were met with a storm of fire. They were trapped on the beaches, suffering horrendous casualties, in another, even more terrible, version of trench warfare. The Dardanelles was a catastrophic failure. And Churchill, as its chief architect, was held responsible. The Conservatives, who had just joined a coalition government, demanded his head. On a day in May 1915, Asquith told him that he had to leave the Admiralty. It was the greatest blow of his life. He wrote that he felt like a sea beast fished up from the depths. My veins threatened to burst from the fall and pressure. Clementine, his wife, later said, I thought he would die of grief. He was given a meaningless post, the chancellorship of the Duchy of Lancaster. For 6 months, he remained in the cabinet, a spectator to the tragedy he had set in motion. He was, he said, finished. But he could not remain idle. In November, he resigned from the government and crossed to France. At the age of 40, a former cabinet minister, he rejoined the army as a major and went to the trenches. He commanded a battalion of the Royal Scots Fusiliers in the mud and horror of Flanders. He was in his element again, sharing the dangers of his men, reveling in the bright eyes of danger. He served on the front for 6 months. But he knew his real work was in London. In the spring of 1916, he returned to the House of Commons, a backbencher with no power and few friends. For the next year and a half, he was in the political wilderness, watching with despair as the war of attrition in France, under the command of Sir Douglas Haig, consumed the flower of Britain's youth. The Somme, Passchendaele? These were battles that cost hundreds of thousands of lives for a few square miles of worthless mud. He spoke out against the slaughter, but few listened. His reputation was still stained by the Dardanelles. Then, in the summer of 1917, Lloyd George, who had replaced Asquith as Prime Minister, brought him back into the government as Minister of Munitions. The Tory press howled in protest, but Lloyd George needed Churchill's energy and drive. Churchill threw himself into the work, reorganizing Britain's war industries and producing the weapons that would finally bring victory. His tanks, which had been dismissed as Winston's folly, proved decisive in the final battles of 1918. After the armistice, he became Secretary of State for War and Air, responsible for demobilizing the vast British Army. But a new threat had emerged in the East, the Bolshevik Revolution. For the next 2 years, Churchill waged a virtual one-man war against Lenin and Trotsky. He called Bolshevism a disease, a pestilence, a ghoul descending from a pile of skulls. He sent British troops and supplies to aid the White Russian armies, but it was a lost cause. His anti-Bolshevik crusade was deeply unpopular at home, and it further alienated him from the rising Labour Party. In 1921, he moved to the Colonial Office. Here, he had 2 great achievements. He presided over the creation of the new Arab states of Iraq and Jordan, drawing their borders in the sand with the help of Lawrence of Arabia. And he was the chief architect of the treaty that created the Irish Free State, ending centuries of strife, though at the cost of partitioning Ireland. But the post-war coalition government was crumbling. In 1922, the Conservatives pulled out, and in the ensuing election, Churchill, running as a National Liberal, lost his seat in Dundee. He was, he said, without an office, without a seat, without a party, and without an appendix. He had had an emergency appendectomy during the campaign. For the next 2 years, he was again in the wilderness. He devoted himself to writing his monumental history of the war, the world crisis, and to painting. And he bought a country home that would become his refuge for the rest of his life, Chartwell. But he could not stay away from politics. In 1924, he rejoined the Conservative Party, saying it felt like coming home. He stood for Parliament in Epping and won. To the astonishment of everyone, the new Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, appointed him Chancellor of the Exchequer, the very post his father had held. It was a triumphant return. But his 5 years at the Treasury were not happy ones. He was no economist. His most fateful decision was to return Britain to the gold standard in 1925. It was a move praised by the financial experts of the day, but it proved to be a disaster. It overvalued the pound, crippled British exports, and led directly to the general strike of 1926. During the strike, Churchill was at his most belligerent. He edited the government's propaganda newspaper, the British Gazette, and his inflammatory language further enraged the working classes, who already saw him as their enemy. When the Baldwin government was defeated in 1929, Churchill was once again out of office. He embarked on a lecture tour of the United States, and was in New York when the stock market crashed. He lost a fortune in a single day. He returned to an England deep in economic depression and political turmoil. He was still a member of Parliament, but he had broken with the leadership of the Conservative Party over 2 great issues. He fiercely opposed the move toward dominion status for India, which he saw as the beginning of the end of the British Empire. And he was becoming increasingly alarmed by the rise of a new power in Germany. In 1932, he was a man in his late 50s, his political career seemingly over. He was isolated, distrusted, and considered a man of the past. He had entered the political wilderness, and this time, it seemed, there would be no return. He had no idea that the greatest chapter of his life, the one for which he had unknowingly been preparing since that day on the beaches of Cuba, was about to begin. Commentary. So, what can we take away from this incredible first half of Winston Churchill's life? It's a story so packed with action, with dizzying highs and devastating lows, that it's easy to get lost in the details. But I think there are a few simple, powerful lessons here that are just as relevant today as they were a century ago. The first, and perhaps the most important, is the power of self-creation. Churchill was not born a lion. He was born a small, sensitive, and often frightened boy. He was dealt a difficult hand in his childhood. But he refused to be a victim of his circumstances. He made a conscious decision to forge a new identity for himself, to build the courage and the resilience that he lacked. He proves that we are not defined by our beginnings, or even by our innate nature. We have the power, through sheer force of will, to become the person we want to be. The second lesson is about the nature of failure. Churchill's career before 1932 was, in many ways, a catalogue of failures. The Dardanelles was a disaster that would have ended the career of any other politician. He lost more elections than almost any of his contemporaries. He was constantly being cast out, rejected, and written off. But he never saw failure as a final verdict. He saw it as a temporary setback, a lesson to be learned, a stepping stone on the path to an eventual victory. He had what we might call an anti-fragile personality. Every time he was knocked down, he seemed to get up stronger, more determined, and more certain of his ultimate purpose. It's a powerful reminder that our response to failure is what defines us, not the failure itself. And finally, there's the lesson of the university of life. Churchill had very little formal education. He was a terrible student. But he never stopped learning. When he was a young officer in India, he realized the gaps in his knowledge and he created his own curriculum, reading the great works of history, philosophy, and economics. He turned his life into a continuous process of self-education. He understood that a real education isn't about what happens in a classroom. It's about a relentless curiosity and a lifelong commitment to understanding the world. So, how can you apply these lessons to your own life? First, build your own university. Don't wait for someone to teach you what you need to know. Identify the subjects that fascinate you, the skills you need to acquire, and go after them with the same hunger that Churchill had. Read widely. Ask questions. Turn every experience into a learning opportunity. Second, reframe your relationship with failure. The next time you face a setback, don't see it as a reflection of your worth. See it as Churchill would have seen it, a necessary part of the journey. Ask yourself, what can I learn from this? How can this make me stronger? Remember that the road to any great achievement is paved with failures. And third, decide who you want to be. Churchill wasn't born with a spirit confident of my rights, as he once wrote. He built that confidence brick by brick, through a lifetime of facing his fears and pushing himself beyond his limits. You have that same power. You can decide what your core values are, what you stand for, and then you can start taking the small, daily actions that will transform that vision into a reality. That was a summary of The Last Lion, Visions of Glory by William Manchester. We've touched on the major themes and stories today, but I have to be honest with you. A summary is like looking at a map of a great mountain range. It can show you the peaks and the valleys, but it can never capture the feeling of actually being there, of breathing the thin mountain air and seeing the world from that breathtaking height. The real magic of this book is in Manchester's incredible prose and the sheer depth of the story. If anything we've talked about today has sparked your interest, I truly hope you'll pick up a copy. It's more than just a history book. It's an exploration of what it means to build a life of consequence, to fight against the odds, and to find the courage to become a lion, even when you start out as something much smaller. The link to the book is in the description. Also, if you found this summary valuable, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next journey into another life-changing book. Let's keep exploring the ideas that have the power to shape our lives, together.